You probably all know the Black Square, a famous avant-garde painting that has radically changed the way we think about art. You've probably heard that this painting was created by Kazymyr Malevych, a Russian painter, but he was not Russian. He comes from Polish and Ukrainian descent, and the Ukrainian sources of his creativity and thinking are huge. In this episode, we will try to explain why it is important to look at Malevych as a Ukrainian artist. Our guest is Tetyana Filevska, a Ukrainian art historian, the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute, the country's major cultural diplomacy institution. She is interviewed by Tetyana Ogarkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar and journalist, an expert at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and a lecturer at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. This is Explaining Ukraine, a podcast by Ukraine World, a multilingual media outlet focused on Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher and the chief editor of Ukraine World. Ukraine World is run by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your support is crucial as our media increasingly relies on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas where we provide assistance to both soldiers and civilians, mainly by bringing cars for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips via PayPal at ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is made in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program.
Hello, Tetyana. Thank you very much for accepting our interview. We'll be talking about Ukrainian avant-garde today, and maybe more specifically about Kazymyr Malevych. So when we talk about Ukrainian avant-garde today, so a lot of problems are here because a lot of painters, a lot of artists we know, they were presented during decades like Russian artists and Russian painters and Russian musicians as well. So where does this problem start and how can we handle it today?
Well, I think this problem lays far beyond just avant-garde and, just a dozen of artists that are known as so-called Russian avant-gardes. And it has to do with Russian policy towards cultures of other countries that were part of the Russian Empire or the USSR. And it's the policy of appropriation of all the heritage. So, we can say that this is something that happens not just to Ukrainian culture, but to the culture of Baltic countries, to the Georgian culture. Everything that came from our part of the world was labeled as Russian because Russia had the monopoly of speaking to the world and of presenting any kind of art to the world and just hijacking other voices. So that's why that policy created this illusion and this manipulation of and visibility of so-called Russian culture and absolute absence and blind spot towards other cultures and other countries of the region. So it's a much wider problem, and this is something that the Ukrainian Institute, for example, work a lot with in talking about decolonization, the need for decolonization, and actually highlighting that lots of things that are known as Russian are not. And this is something that we ask our partners to keep in mind and to be cautious with. If something is labeled Russian, just doubt it. Just doubt it. Double check. Make sure you clearly understand where it comes from, who created it, what does it tell about. And in a lot of cases, you will find out that it's not Russian.
Simply not Russian, because Russia was an empire during 19th century, but as well during 20th century. When we talk about Soviet Union, not everybody clearly understand that it's not a republic. That this is specifically an empire where different parts exist, and this Ukrainian part, Georgian part, Moldavian part, and a lot of bright people came from other regions. So, as you say, we advise you to look on the map and read biographies. And in these biographies, you will find a lot of interesting facts. When somebody was born in Kyiv, we'll be talking now about Kazymyr Malevych. So, when somebody was born in Kyiv in Polish family, it doesn't make it automatically Russian artist. So, let's talk about Kazymyr Malevych, he was born in Kyiv, right? And his first language was Polish language, right? And his second language was Ukrainian language, and his third language was Russian language.
Well, no, his first language was Ukrainian, and Polish was roughly spoken in the family because actually the Malevich family was assimilated in Ukrainian society. They lived for at least 300 years in Ukraine. Their family mansion was in Turbiv, which is a village, a small town in Vinnytsia, and they were assimilated in Ukraine. And they didn't have any relatives living in Poland. And Kazymyr Malevych visited Poland once in his lifetime, for the first time in 1927. He was an adult. And I mean, he knew some of the spoken Polish language, but it was not the language he spoke every day. So it was a Ukrainian language with some Polish words. And he only heard Russian for the first time when he was a teenager. And he clearly mentioned that in his autobiography, that he couldn't even understand what these Russians were talking about because he just didn't understand the language.
What is important in Kazymyr Malevich case is that he left his autobiography. So we do have this text. It's extremely interesting because in this text, Malevich talks a lot about his childhood, about his young years, but also he talks about his further career, included in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, and any other places. And there's a key document to his identity because in autobiography, somebody who writes an autobiography, this is about yourself, this is about your identity, this is about your own personal history. What do we know about Malevich's childhood?
Well, we know quite a lot, and we discover more and more because it seems like the most researched artist in the world, who is Kazymyr Malevych, has still lots of blind spot, especially relating to his Ukrainian biography. So we clearly know that he was born in Kyiv on Zhilyanska Street, in back then the outskirts of city. Now it's almost the center of city. It happened in February 1879, despite the fact that Malevich himself thought he was 1 year older and he thought he was born in 1978, but it's wrong. We know the exact date thanks to the documents, again, that are kept in Ukrainian archives in Kyiv. We know that his father, being of a Polish noble family, actually he had the noble status, but the family was quite poor, and they lost their money and their wealth because they were part of the Polish rebellion against Russian Empire in 1863. So some of his uncles were very involved in that rebellion, and because of that they were imprisoned, they had to give up their mansions. So by the time when Kazymyr Malevych was born, his father had to go and find himself a job actually to make a living because he couldn't afford just being a wealthy nobleman. Back then it was the sugar beet industry was developing, and it needed educated people, and that's how Severin Malevych, Kazymyr's father, got a job into the sugar beet industry. He was a deputy director, an engineer, and as these factories, sugar beet factories, they were based on in villages all over Ukraine, and this was a work that hired people for a contract, which would be a 1, 2, 3 year contract. Family moved a lot, and Malevich's childhood was spent in villages, in Ukrainian villages all over Ukraine. The geography is really vast. And we know that he was growing up among Ukrainian peasants, and he thought of himself as part of that community. He enjoyed being part of, this peasant life. He admired everything about Ukrainian peasants, and he learned everything that they were doing, how they were dressing, how they were eating, and what kind of art they were making. And he remembered that in his autobiography that actually art that was taught to him by Ukrainian peasant women, because women were responsible for creating arts and crafts in Ukrainian traditional culture. They were his first teachers, art teachers. So basically that was the foundation, the basic education, we can say, he received, despite the fact he actually never had a proper education. It's really important in Malevich's
He
case.
had 4 years of elementary school.
3 years out of 4, yeah. So he didn't even graduate the 4-year school, yeah, in Parkhomivka in Kharkiv region. And he actually never had a proper artistic education. Although he had a chance to visit or attend Kyiv drawing school. He was a teenager back then, and he also remembered how impressed he was by everything he saw in the school, and how he met one of the professors, Mykola Pimonenko, who was back then one of the most important Ukrainian artists, who was very successful, very fashionable, just a dandy type of artist. And Malevich, meeting this professional artist, he had a dream himself to become a professional artist. So that was a very important part of his life. And we know that until 18 years old, he lived in Ukraine, and the last place was Konotop. It's a very important location and place, and he spent several years in Konotop, and that was
and
also...
he wrote his first painting, we know, in Konotop, right?
Yes, he created his first painting, and he sold his first painting in Konotop, and he remembered this with a lot of humor, as well as he pays a lot of attention to the food that he enjoyed in Konotop, and actually in Ukraine in general.
Yeah, and let's explain to our audience that Konotop is a Sumy region, so it's northeastern Ukraine, and it's quite close to Russian border. And I do remember you were talking about his childhood between peasants, and I do remember some lines from his autobiography when he said that, look at these people. He just made this description of peasants like people who live in art, and he opposed them to manufacture people who were just simple and technology people. And he was really convinced that art of these simple people living in nature is something magic. And so he as you explained, that his first teachers were simple women from Ukrainian villages who did some handcraft pieces of art, and he was the best teacher in his life. And so geography is quite wide in Ukraine. It's Ukrainian. And could we explain this first works of Malevich by Ukrainian landscapes, right? So it was about the night, right?
You mean the first work?
This one, which was created and sold, as you said, in Konotop. By the way, today they have in Konotop, they have been there, and they have this Malevich place, Malevich pizzeria, by the way, shelled by Russian drone. And it was a beautiful restaurant with all this decoration coming from Malevich later periods, from Suprematism, and very, very nice place. And they had some damages due to these Russian drones attacking this particular place.
Mm-hmm. So what we know about this painting, because we cannot see it, unfortunately, we don't know where it is, who bought it, but we know that it was like a landscape, a river, and a boat by the river, on the riverside, and we know that most probably it was a copy from the magazine called Niva, because there was a very kind of popular magazine that Malevich had access to, and they published reproductions, copies of other famous paintings of international artists. And we know that Malevich was self-taught to copy things. He had a student's book, how to copy things, and that was probably one of his kind of students' exercises. But it was probably very good, well done. And one of his friends decided that it's worth, exhibiting. So he took it without Malevich's knowledge. Malevych was surprised when he saw the work exhibited in the vitrine in the window of the local shop. And he was even more surprised that the work was sold very soon for 5 rubles, for 5, and he counted that he could buy and eat sausage every day for a month. And he realized that he can make a living out of his work, out of his art. He was very proud of himself.
Yeah, sure. But when we look at this particular painting, not the real one, but the reproduction, so we see that it's not Malevich we all know. So this is not about avant-garde. This is still not about avant-garde. This is not about Fauvism or Cubo-futurism, and even less about suprematism. We do know that Malevich had many different periods, and he started from more or less classical, painting, and moving forward to avant-garde. How can we explain these major periods in his life, and under which influence he changed, and he was so attracted to avant-garde?
Well, I think Malevich was developing and growing as, the history of art was moving. And that was a very important period in art history when, the classical art, the realist art was in crisis because of many reasons. But first of all, probably because of the technological innovations, especially photography and video. And, since you could make a photograph of your family or of your house and in this way keep yourself in history, what was the reason to pay lots of money for the painter to do the same? So there was a question on really the essence of art and what art should actually do if it doesn't need to copy the reality any longer. And that was the moment when actually Malevich was learning to be an artist. He got all the magazines from Europe, from Paris. He could learn and he could read about all the discussions happening at that moment. And he was trying to try it himself. So his way of education was just like getting art history through his own experience. So as he learned, about Impressionism, and Impressionism was a big thing, he wanted to become an Impressionist, and he did. He had a period of work and a series of works dedicated to that. Then there was Expressionisms and Symbolism. So he was actually trying each of the new waves of art, trying to find his own style. And I think it was the unique moment in history when actually every artist had a dream to invent his own art, art movement. And Malevich was not an exception. He was very ambitious, and he had this he had the belief that he has a mission to change the history of art. And he believed in himself so much that he would not stop. He would not be satisfied unless he did it. And so when he actually invented Suprematism, this very...
in 1915, right?
In 1915, yes, that was the year it was created. And the exhibition with the famous Black Square took place. And it was very important for him that he, gave the new, the new direction, the new turn to art history. And he invited everyone to come into this door of the new art, that he's opened with his Black Square. So, but it was a very rare moment in history when artists could actually do that. Because, nowadays it's impossible anymore. You cannot reinvent art because Malevich has already done that. But 100 years ago, it was possible, and he was convinced that he is the one to do that.
Yeah. What surprises me in all this suprematism of Malevich, Black Square, but not only Black Square, is that Malevich is, on one hand, he's somebody who is very deeply rooted in Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and this peasants' culture. This old culture, all these colors of the Ukrainian village and all the simply life, etc., etc. But on the other hand, he's extremely innovative. I mean, he's fond of impressionists, and then he's fond of cubists, and then he invents something completely new. And so this paradox of combining something extremely old with something extremely new. And when he tries to explain his black square, because he explained it a lot, he tried it in his texts, we find a kind of different explanations, and some of them are pretty mystic, right?
Well, I mean, I don't think Malevich was very unique in kind of looking back to the roots, because it was something that many of the avant-garde artists did. So, I mean, Picasso looked at the African masks, for example. So, I mean, there was a tendency. So, trying to reinvent art, they all wanted to go back to the point zero, where the art actually started. And I mean, what else you can look at if you don't look at the traditional art, which is like kind of a basic, crafts, So I think it was a rather typical way of reinventing art as such. And Malevich was just like following the trend there, basically, yeah. And he didn't confess that it was, the Ukrainian traditional art that inspired him. We can, of course, trace this. We can, of course, see these similarities, as well as we can see similarities, for example, between Malevich and Pimonenko, because there are a series of peasant portraits from Pimonenko and from Malevich that are very similar in many aspects. So we can see also the influence there. But coming back to the traditional art, it was one of the influence, definitely, but we can also say that Malevich was super inspired by Cézanne, and he was, I think, a follower of Cézanne, and the discoveries of the color, for example, it was crucial for Malevich's suprematism, which means dominance of color as such. So color is not just to paint in the form, but it has the meaning itself. Yeah. So color is as meaningful as the form. But I mean, I think it was very dynamic artistic community back then, and things just influenced each other. So people influenced each other. For example, even taking another prominent avant-garde artist, Vladimir Tatlin, who was actually also had a huge Ukrainian connection and
From
background.
Kharkiv region, right?
We don't know exactly where he was born, but there is a version that he was born in Kharkiv. We don't have the document. Yes, he could be born in Kharkiv, and he was raised in Kharkiv. Then he worked in Kyiv as well as Malevich in the 20s. So he played bandura. He knew well Ukrainian songs. He knew well Ukrainian culture. So there was also a lot of influence, Ukrainian influence in Tatlin. So Tatlin was also very important in terms of innovation, in terms of some progressive ideas that he suggested. And at times Malevich and Tatlin were enemies. They wouldn't talk to each other. They competed between each other. But again, we can see how Tatlin and Malevich influenced each other. So it's a very interesting time, that the beginning of 20th century, and how art was developing in that very short period of time, basically, just a few years before First World War, and a decade later, and but basically it gave the influence to the whole 20th century art.
Mm-hmm. So this first exhibition of suprematist Malevich takes place in St. Petersburg, but there is another place which is important, maybe important in this story. This is about this village Verbivka in Ukraine. And we are discovering recently a lot of stories about this particular village and about this traditional Ukrainian broderie made by local women, and a lot of artists like Alexandra Ekster were visiting this village. And there are also some people say that Malevich was also interested in Verbivka. Has he come even once to Verbivka? What do we know?
Well, we don't know if he visited Verbivka in person, but we definitely know he was part of the initiative. And the initiative was behind the initiative. There were two important artists from Kyiv, Natalia Davidova and Alexandra Ekster. So Natalia Davidova was the owner of the mansion in Verbivka. Her maiden name is Hudim Levkovich, and it's she was from a famous Ukrainian family that is rooted in Cossacks history, in 18th century history. So it's a very famous family, and she married this Decemberist family, Davidovs. So Dmitro Davidov was her husband, and as an owner of this mansion, she decided to continue her family tradition, as her ancestors had a big production of fabrics, very sophisticated and very expensive fabrics that was produced also in another place in Cherkasy region, in Grigorivka. So she decided to kind of move on with this, supporting this craft in her local community, but together with contemporary art. So it was, we can say, a pop-up project, a combination of a traditional craft, embroidery, and a contemporary art. So Alexandra Ekster, who was an art director of that art tile or workshop, she's invited her contemporary peer artist friends, including Kazymyr Malevych, who was, already a prominent artist and who had interest in this collaboration as well because of his he was fond of village culture and traditional peasant culture. So they provided sketches for embroidery that were sent to Verbivka, and then these women in Verbivka did different things. I mean, these were pillows, these were scarves, these were little bags, etc., etc. So these were things that people could use in everyday life. And then these things with these avant-garde elements embroidered on them, they were sold. And they were so successful.
And there was also an exhibition, right?
There were several exhibitions, yes. And there were also, things were for sale on those exhibitions. So that's one of the reasons we don't have many of the objects, because they were in use. People actually, used them every day. They didn't end up in museums. But one of the interesting things about Malevych's collaboration is that the first exhibition of Verbivka took place in October 1915. And there, things were presented with suprematist designs. So we can say that Malevych sent his suprematic sketches to Verbivka before he showed the black square and the suprematist art in public. So we can say that the first viewers of Malevych's suprematist were Ukrainian peasant women.
Yes, exactly. And the project itself combining something extra ultra new and something extra old, so it preceded, in fact, this famous exhibition about which you can read in all Russian books, like this exhibition 0.10. So it was, for decades, it was presented like the first suprematist exhibition of Malevych, right? So, but if you dig into history, you find some other Ukrainian episode even in this suprematist Malevych. So, and it was in colors, and we do have some sketches, right? We do have some sketches from Malevych in this. Some photos.
There are some reconstructions of the sketches and some photographs. Yes, there are some photographs from the 1915 exhibition that are.
And at that time, Malevych is in St. Petersburg, and he's already famous artist, and everybody talks about suprematism for sure. He writes a couple of texts trying to explain what suprematism is, and he's becoming more and more famous. But then in the 20s, he also comes back to Ukraine, so in late 20s. So can you explain why he comes back to Kyiv and spends another important time here in Ukraine?
So after spending quite a lot of time between Moscow and Petrograd and St. Petersburg, Leningrad, he finds himself in mid-20s actually basically crossed out of the art process, and that was because the political situation has changed after Lenin died and Stalin came to power. The context for avant-garde art changed dramatically. And the new Stalin's government and the new policy was to actually eliminate all the avant-garde initiatives out of the Soviet space, because the Soviet Union started to become an empire, and the empire doesn't need a revolutionary art, and avant-garde in its essence is revolutionary. So starting from mid-20s, many artists were kind of lacking ways to work and to have any kind of a public presence, and Malevych was not. Malevych was also one of them. So he was fired from his Institute of Artistic Culture. He was not able to exhibit. His articles were not published. So he basically lost ways of work and ways of making his living. And it was very different in Ukraine back then, because during 20s in Ukraine, you could still have more creative freedom, artistic freedom, because the relationship between the Soviet Ukraine and the Soviet Russia were very different at that time. So Soviet Ukraine had much more autonomy, especially in cultural sphere, and we know about this period known as Ukrainization, which allowed Ukrainian culture to develop autonomously and give lots of resource for the development of culture. And because of that, many of avant-garde artists came from Russia to Ukraine because they still could work here and they still could produce their art. It was not only Malevych, it was also Tatlin, it was also Zygovertov, for example. There were several others. So Malevych got an invitation from the Kyiv Art Institute, and he was an invited professor, and he was also invited to kind of assist and create a new methodology of art education. And Malevych worked with that in Vitebsk in the beginning of the Soviet Union, and then in Leningrad. So he had some ideas, and he had this theory. It was so-called medical theory that he could offer. So we can say that the last a very efficient and productive period of his life was the Kyiv period between 1928 and 1930, when Malevych was able to work here in Kyiv Art Institute. He was able to teach. He had his last private exhibition in the Kyiv Art Gallery. He was publishing his articles in Nova Generatsiya, in a very famous and important magazine published in Kharkiv by Mikhail Semenko, who was actually also inspired by Malevych's Suprematism. So, I mean, it was a very important period, which was very unknown until just recently. So until 2016, we didn't even, have this notion of Kyiv period, because unfortunately very few archives survived. And there was, this appropriation of Malevych in Russia that would just not allow Ukrainian art historians to claim that, we can say that there was this period. But after 2016, things changed because of the discovery of the Marian Kropivnitsky archive. Marian Kropivnitsky was an assistant of Malevych in the Kyiv Art Institute, and thanks to him and his family, the archive survived throughout 20th century. And I was lucky to have the opportunity to publish it, and that's how the book Kyiv period, Malevych Kyiv period, came to being, and it actually claimed the Kyiv period in his oeuvre.
Mm-hmm. And it is teaching, it's notes, it's some pictures as well, and all these important years in late Malevych period was discovered, and so you're the author of this book, so it's important testimony that the heritage of Malevych a big part of it, it's linked to Ukraine, to Kyiv in particular. We do remember Dziga Vertov also coming to Kyiv, and also to Odessa to make this revolution in cinema. He was making this cinema eye, Kino Oko. It was already in Odessa because simply he couldn't do that in Moscow because all this repression started in Moscow already, but it was still some period of time of relative liberty here in Kyiv and somewhere in Odessa, in Odessa Kinostudia, and somewhere for people. But then everything changed once again, we do know. And we do know that the late years in Malevych's life were extremely tragic because he comes back right to Moscow, and this is not about liberty. Another important episode. So after suprematism, so one could imagine that this black square, this is the ultimate expression of what a painting could be. But surprisingly enough, in Malevych's story, we see that he comes back to not to realistic painting, but to kind of figurative painting in his last years. How do we explain it today?
Well, it's quite tricky because for a very long time, Malevych was a mystificator. So for a very long time, everyone thought that all of these paintings were created before the Black Square. Because when Malevych returns to painting, which he quit in early 20s, when he said that, the history of art is over, suprematism is the end and the finale of art history, and I don't need to paint any longer. No one needs to paint because we just need to kind of convert suprematism into life and create, architecture, design, craft, whatever, based on the ideas of suprematism. But then something really happens. And in the late 20s, he returns to painting. But as he didn't want to kind of,
recognize that
he didn't want to oppose himself, he signed these paintings with earlier dates. So he would, create a painting in 1928 and say that it was created in 1911 or 1913 or whatever. And he just created his fake art. So basically he faked himself. But it was not a problem for Malevych, not at all. I mean, he could copy himself. He created numerous black squares. He created copies of his own paintings. So it was not a problem for him at all. But actually why he started. So, I think that the reason that he actually took the painting again and the paint in his hands again was a very pragmatic one. He was preparing his private show. It was a retrospective of all of his art career, and because some of his important paintings stayed in Berlin, because he had in 1927 he had his first and last international tour. He took his paintings to Warsaw and then to Berlin. He was also supposed to travel to Paris, but he never did because he received a telegram, which we don't know, what was in that telegram. But Malevych had to leave Berlin and return to the Soviet Union in 24 hours. So that's why he didn't have time to, take off his exhibition, pack it. He just urgently left everything with a little note and came back to the Soviet Union. And he didn't have the chance to return these artworks after that. So he decided to just recreate and copy his own paintings. And I think in that process of kind of repainting his own career, repainting his own kind of way in art, I think he liked. Yeah, I think he really enjoyed painting again. And then a new type of art that you probably mentioned is the supranaturalism. We can say that it was called supranaturalism, supranaturalism. It was a kind of a combination between realism or naturalism and suprematism. These are these famous figures without faces, these sportsmen and endless peasants.
Which are
without
also in
hands.
a way archaic, because if you look at Ukrainian traditional motanka, it reminds me of that. I might be mistaken.
Yeah, it's very basic. It's very kind of geometrical. So we cannot say that he really does return to realism painting, because it's not. It's not realistic. It's very schematic. It's very geometrical. And it's a kind of a combination, or it's a continuation of suprematism, I would say. Because what suprematism is using the basic figures and the basic colors, and allowing an artist to create his or her own world with these basic elements. And I mean, it doesn't. Of course, Malevich wanted to free the artist from the necessity to copy reality. But he didn't want to limit artists. So he decided, if we don't limit ourselves, we can also use, naturalism or like realism, but make it in a suprematic way. So I think it was a continuation of suprematism, actually, and it was also very important that he comes back to the peasant topic again. It's his second peasant cycle. The first one was in 1910s, and then the second one is the 1920s. And I think that second peasant cycle has a very important political notion and political meaning, because we remember that Malevich spent his childhood in villages, and we also know that in the 20s, Ukrainian village has undergone the policy of collectivization, and it actually destroyed Ukrainian village. So I mean,
and let us explain to our audience that collectivization meant this year that the party was taking land away from peasants, and it became a state property, collective property. So private property was transformed into state property.
Yeah,
right?
So private property was neglected, and peasants were forced to go to collective farms, and that was something that ruined this paradise that the peasants had as to Malevich. So he was observing actually how Ukrainian village was destroyed, how it was falling into chaos, and I think it was one of the motivation to bring back the peasant as the main character of his painting. And we can see that particularly in the sketch that he did in Kyiv in 1930. The sketch is kept in the collection of the National Art Museum, and it was a drawing for the conference hall of the Ukrainian Academy of Science in Kyiv. And it shows a peasant woman, dressed in a very long red blood color dress next to the big cross, and these big crosses are usually standing in Ukrainian villages on crossroads. And on the back of her, behind her, we can see like a village landscape, but this village landscape looks like a cemetery. And it looks very depressive. It looks very, negative, yeah. And I think that was the reason why Malevich's friend Lev Kramarenko, who actually asked Malevich to draw this painting, and he suggested, that this could be a good side project and would allow Malevich to make some money. He never showed it to anyone. He was just afraid that if, the communists would see this, they would really understand how Malevich was, critical about the communist policy, how he actually suffered from, the experience of the Ukrainian village. And that's why the sketch was never given to anyone. And in late 70s, the wife of Lev Kramarenko, Irina Zhdanko, gave it to the National Art Museum.
Mm-hmm. And there's another tragic episode in Ukraine's history, which Malevich also knew about. It's Holodomor. And there is another painting which might be his expression, his artistic expression about this artificial famine, right?
Well, it's controversial because we don't know exact dates of Malevich's when Malevich really created this painting. So usually they are dated between 1928 and 1932. So we cannot say that Malevich witnessed Holodomor. He might have heard about it from his friends, Ukrainian friends and colleagues, but he hardly had the chance to witness it himself because it was after he was already fired from the academy or from the Kyiv Art Institute, and he roughly visited Ukraine after that. So we doubt. I mean, it could be a criticism also of Holodomor, but most probably it was just his observation of what collectivization did to Ukrainian villages.
So you think it's more linked to collectivization, but not to Holodomor, which
we don't have the proof.
We
don't have the facts that prove that, and I mean, until we have, I would not risk to state that.
And maybe the last question, which is important now for during decades, Kazymyr Malevych works were presented like works of Russian artists. We observed that in many museums across Europe and beyond. And it happens that after full-scale invasion, some prominent European museums finally started mentioning Malevich as Ukrainian artist. Do you think this is important, and this political support, political change is important in what Ukrainian avant-garde is and what the heritage of this Ukrainian avant-garde is?
Well, I think it's a wider question about identities of artists as such, and how we understand identities, and how people could understand their identity 100 years ago when the political reality was totally different. The tendency now, with all the decolonization effort that have been taking place for decades, is that we should not limit the identity of people to a singular identity, because we are usually plural identities. So I mean, even if you do your DNA test and it shows you're 100% Ukrainian, which is not the case, I'm sure, in anyone's case. Mine didn't. I mean, I have a mixture of various East European, Balkan, Baltic, whatever bloods, and it's even more complicated to other of my relatives. But I mean, for example, for people like Kazymyr Malevych, who lived on the crossroads of centuries and empires, when things and people started to move much more than before, also thanks to the political change, but also to technological change. There was just transport that could take you, trains and planes that could take you much faster to other, and cars, that could take you places much more. And people enjoyed these privileges, so they did travel a lot. So for Malevych, who was born in Kyiv to a Polish family, he was forced to get his education in Russia because Ukraine was not allowed to have its own art academy until the independence of Ukrainian National Republic in 1917. He was forced to go there. He worked in Belarus, for example, in Vitebsk, and he was a very important figure for the history of Belarusian art. He was very influential in Western Europe, so, I mean, artists from Netherlands and from Germany were inspired by Malevich and kind of followed his art. We cannot say that, his identity was very monolithic and there was only Ukrainian. Yes, he did call himself a Ukrainian. Yes, if you read carefully his letters, his memoirs,
even though he was writing in Russian.
Even if he was writing in Russian, because he was, a person of his time, and the time was that everything was Russified. And if you lived in that legal and political reality, you were supposed to speak Russian and to write in Russian, yes. But, I mean, he does refer to himself as Ukrainian a lot, because he feels the connection to this culture. He feels the connection to these people. He knows that they are Ukrainian, and he associates with him. So many times he says that, I was Ukrainian, me and him were Ukrainians. And he even made a political choice when he was given a passport, and the Soviet Union actually introduced passport in 1920s. And there was this line where you had to state what nationality you are. He chose Ukrainian, and we know that there is a fact about it. Yeah, but we cannot say that, Ukrainian identity was crucial for him. It was probably dominant. It was probably the most important for him, but it was not the only one. So, of course, we cannot ask Malevych if he considered himself a Ukrainian artist, but I think just kind of putting himself in one identity would not be true, because he also felt Polish, because he was also part of the reality of the Russian Empire, and he was also part of the movement of artists who were based in Moscow and Leningrad. So, and he was also important for art in Belarus. So, he was everything and European, and he actually really believed that art has to go beyond borders. And he had this utopian view that, art has to transcend borders. We know that it failed, we know all the lessons of 20th century, but he still had this idea, this utopian idea of kind of universal art, whatever that means. But we understand that, it could only be, his art could only be created because he was he was educated and grown in certain local culture, which inspired him, which created him, which, gave the senses and the forms and the inspirations that made him Kazymyr Malevych.
Thank you very much, Tetyana. Most importantly, at the same time, is that Russia, by changing this affiliation of Kazymyr Malevych from Russian to Ukrainian, Russia's culture can no longer use Kazymyr Malevych as a justification of this big, great Russian culture, which has more rights than any other nations, and to just justify this cruel aggression against Ukraine, but as well against many other countries like Syria and like Georgia before. So that's about using culture as a soft power. That's why politically it's also important to remind these multiple identities Kazymyr Malevych, famous painter, had. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. We shouldn't call him a Russian artist. That would be the biggest mistake.
Thank you.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by Ukraine World, a multilingual media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher and the chief editor of Ukraine World. Our guest today was Tetyana Filevska, a Ukrainian art historian, the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute, the country's major cultural diplomacy institution. She was interviewed by Tetyana Ogarkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar and journalist, an expert at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and a lecturer at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your support is crucial as our media increasingly relies on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas through PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is made in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.